Hello, world, and welcome back to the ViBedTime channel. Today, we're going to continue our chapter reading of the Mediterranean Caper. We're on chapter 13 today. For those who are new here, welcome. Feel free to catch up with us by looking at the other chapters I've done on the playlist in my channel. And for those of you that's been following along, let's get right into the reading where we left off, where apparently Pitt has a new plan on how to catch this Von Till guy. So let's not waste a lot of time and get right into it, shall we? Without further ado, y'all, here we go. Chapter 13. The eerie phosphorus sent forth gradually diminished and fell away from the old straight up and down bow of Queen Artemisia as the aging ship slowly lost its way and came to a stop. Then the anchor clattered down into 10 fathoms of water, and the navigation lights blinked out, leaving a black silhouette resting on an even blacker sea. It was as though the Queen Artemisia had never been. 200 feet away, a small wooden packing crate bobbed lazily on the swells. It was a common type of crate, one of empty thousands that float in cast-off neglect on every sea and waterway of the world. To the casual eye at least, it looked like an ordinary flotsam. Even the stenciled letters that advertised this end up pointed incongruously downward towards the seabed. There was, however, one thing that made this particular crate quite different. It wasn't empty. There must be a better way, Pitt thought wryly from inside the box as a wave bumped it against the top of his head. But at least it was a blank sight better than swimming in plain view when the morning light appeared. He took a mouthful of seawater and coughed it out. Then he puffed lightly into the mouthpiece of his flotation vest, increasing his buoyancy, and returned his gaze to the ship through a jagged-cut peephole. The Queen Artemisia lay silent. Only the faint hum of her generators and the slap of the waves on her hull betrayed her presence. Gradually, the sounds faded away, and the ship became a part of the silence. For a long time, Pitt listened, but no other sounds traveled across the water to his bobbing outpost. No footsteps on a still deck. No masculine voices shouting commands. No clink of human-operated machinery. Nothing. The silence was total and very puzzling. It was like a phantom ship with a phantom crew. Then starboard anchor was down, and Pitt made his way towards it, slowly pushing the box from within. The light breeze and the incoming tide worked in his favor, and soon the box gently nudged the anchor chain. He swiftly removed the U.S. driver's air tank and attached its backpack webbing through one of the big steel chain links. Then, using the regulator's single air hose as a line, he slipped his fins, mask, and snorkel over the second stage mouthpiece and let the whole package dangle just beneath the surface. Pitt grabbed the chain, looking up at the seemingly endless links that vanished into the darkness, and felt like Jack climbing the beanstalk. He thought of Terry, lying asleep in a cozy bunk back at the first attempt. He thought of her soft and fluid body and began to wonder what in blank he was doing here. Terry had wondered too, but over a different question. Why take me to a ship? I can't go out there and meet all those brainy scientists looking like this. She lifted the hem of her transparent negligee, displaying her legs to the thighs. Oh, what the blank, Pitt laughed. It'll probably be the sexiest thing that happened to them in years. What about Uncle Bruno? Tell him you went shopping on the mainland. Tell him anything. You're over 21. I guess it would be fun to be naughty, she giggled. It's just like a romantic adventure story in the cinema. That's one way to look at it, Pitt had said. He figured she would think that, and he'd been right. Pitt went up to the anchor chain, copying the style of a Polynesian native climbing a palm tree after coconuts. He soon reached out the hawser hole and peered over the veil. He hesitated, listening and watching for any movement in the shadows. Not a soul was visible. The foredeck was deserted. He swung over the side, crouched low, and moved silently across the deck to the foremast. The blacked out ship was a blessing. It was the cargo loading lamps. If the cargo loading lamps had been on, the midships and foredecks would have been bathed in a flood of white light. Not the best circumstances for sneaking around unnoticed. Pitt was awful thankful that the darkness blotted out his dripping water trail across the foredeck. He paused, waiting for the expected sounds of movement that never came. It was quiet, far too quiet. There was something else about the ship that didn't gel in Pitt's subconscious mind, but he couldn't pin it down. It eluded him for the present. Pitt reached down, unsheathing the driver's knife strapped to his calf, and moved aft, holding the 7-inch stainless blade well out in front of him. It seemed incredible, but Pitt had a clear view of the bridge, and as far as he could see, it was abandoned. He melted into the shadows and climbed the ladder to the bridge, his feet padding noiselessly on the steel steps. The wheelhouse was dark and empty. The spokes of the wheel reached out in dark loneliness, and the binnacle stood like a mute, brass-plated sentinel. Pitt couldn't make out the wording, but he knew from the angle of the pointers that the telegraph stood at all stop. In the dim lights from the stars, he was able to make out a rack attached to the ledge below the port window. His fingers played over the contents. Aldous lamp, flare gun, flares. Then he got lucky. His hand touched the familiar cylindrical shape of a flashlight. He slipped out of his swim trunks and wrapped them around the lens till the light offered nothing but a faint glow. Then he checked every foot of the wheelhouse, deck, bulkheads, equipment. The tiny indicator lights on the control console showed the only glimmer of life. The curtains were drawn into the chart room at the back of the wheelhouse. It was inconceivable that any chart room would be so clean. The charts laid in orderly stacks, their fields of squares and numbers crossed by precisely drawn pencil lines. Pitt slipped the knife back into his sheath, propped the flashlight against a copy of Brown's Nautical Almanac, and scanned the chart markings. The lines coincided exactly with the Queen Artemisia's known course from Shanghai. He noted the fact that there were no mistakes or erasures by whoever figured the compass corrections. It was neat, too much so. The logbook was open at the last entry. 03.52 hours. Bradyfield beacon bearing 312 degrees, approximately 8 miles. Wind southwest 2 knots. The gods protect Minerva. The time showed that this entry had been made less than an hour before Pitt swam out from the beach. But where was the crew? There was no sign of the deck watch, and the lifeboats were secured in their divots. The abandoned helm didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Pitt's mouth was dry, a dusty cavern in which his tongue lay like a rubber sponge. A hammer pounded in his head, blurring his thinking. He left the wheelhouse, softly closing the door behind him, and found an alleyway leading to the captain's cabin. The door was ajar. He gently eased it full open and stepped soundlessly and sideways into the steel cubicle. A movie set, it looked like. It looked like a movie set. That was the only way Pitt could describe it. Everything was neat and tidy, and exactly where it should have been. Across the far bulkhead, the Queen Artemisia loomed in tranquil splendor from the amateurish oil painting. Pitt shuddered at the choice of colors. The ship sailed on a purple sea. The signature in the lower right corner was signed by a Sophia Remick. There was the usual photograph on the desk with a matronly, round-faced woman staring out of a cheap metal frame. The inscription read, "To the captain of my heart, from his loving wife." It was unsigned, but obviously written by the same hand that had photographed the painting. And next to the photograph, on an otherwise barren desktop, a carefully laid pipe reposed in an empty ashtray. Pitt picked it up and smelled the blackened bowl. It had been smoked. It hadn't been smoked in months. It hadn't been smoked in months. Nothing looked used or handled. It was a museum without a dust, a house without odor, and the ship herself quiet as a graveyard. He returned to the alleyway, closing the door behind him, almost wishing some strange voice, any voice, would shout, "Who goes there?" or "What are you doing here?" The stillness made his sweat run cold. Pitt began to imagine vague shapes in shadowy corners. His heartbeat thumped at an accelerating pace. It couldn't have been more than 10 seconds that he stood there not moving a muscle, forcing his mind back into rational control. It'll be dawn soon, he thought. Hurry, must hurry. He ran down the port alleyway, ignoring any attempt at stealth and secrecy, and threw open the other cabin doors. Each small compartment was like the black hole of Calcutta. One quick sweep of the hooded light told the same story as the captain's cabin. He also searched the radio cabin. The transmitter was warm and preset on a VHF frequency, but the radio operator was conscious by his absence, conspicuous by his absence. Pitt slipped the door shut and headed aft. Companionways, port, and starboard alleyways, they all seemed to merge into one long black underground tunnel. It was an effort not to lose his sense of direction in the maze. A naked man, except for his flotation vest, in a dark nightmare of gray paint and steel walls. He tripped over a bulkhead step and fell, banging his shin, and dropped the flashlight, all in harmony with an uttered bleep. The flashlight had fallen on the hard deck, shattering the lens and blinking out. He knelt on his hands and knees, muttering additional curses and searching frantically. After agonizing seconds, his hands grasped the aluminum-plated case. The glass on the lens tinkled with grim foreboding inside the cloth cover. He picked it up and pushed the switch forward. The bulb blinked on as dull as ever. Pitt uttered a gasp of relief and shined the subdued beam down the passageway. It dimly illuminated a door that was titled Fire Passage, number 3 hold. The great chambers of Carlsbad Caverns couldn't have looked much less formidable than number 3 hold. All that Pitt's light showed was a vast steel cave crammed with countless sacks and stacked from deck to hatch cover on wooden tiers. The air was permeated with a sweet incense kind of odor. The coca from Ceylon, Ceylon, Pitt surmised. He took the diver's knife and cut a small half-inch hole in the coarse cloth of one of the sacks. A flow of stony hard beans fell to the deck, bouncing and rattling like a hail on a cone-set hut. A quick examination under the flashlight proved the parchment skin beans to be the genuine article. Suddenly, he heard a noise. It was faint and indistinct, but it was there. He froze, listening. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had come, and silence once more gripped the haunted ship. A deserted ship with all its dark and hidden secrets. Maybe it's a ghost ship after all, Pitt mused. Another Mary Celeste or Flying Dutchman. All that was missing was a stormy sea with rain lashing the top decks and lightning flashing in the night and a gale shrieking through the derricks. There was nothing more to see in the hold. Pitt left and headed for the engine room. He lost the precious 8 minutes finding the right companionway. The heart of the ship was warm from the heat of the engines and smelled of hot oil. He stood on the catwalk above the huge and lifeless machinery and searched for a sign that would indicate bona fide human activity. The flashlight caught the gleam of a burnished pipe that snaked across the bulkheads in geometric parallel lines, ending in a mass fusion of valves and gauges. Then the faint beam fell on a carelessly waggled oily rag. Above the rag was a shelf containing several coffee-stained cups, and to the left of those, a tray of scattered tools with greasy finger marks. At least someone was working this part of the ship, he thought, quite relieved. He knew that most engine rooms were kept as clean as a hospital ward, but this one was messy. But where was the chief engineer and his oilmen? They couldn't have evaporated into the Aegean atmosphere. Pitt started to leave, then he stopped. There it was again, the same mysterious sound, echoing through the ship's hull. He stood stock still, holding his breath for what seemed a lifetime. It was an odd, uncanny sound, like the scraping of a ship's keel over a submerged rock or coral reef. Pitt involuntarily shivered. It also reminded him of the way chalk squeaked across the blackboard. The sound lasted for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it was punctured with the dull clink of metal against metal. Pitt had never sat bathed with cold sweat in a cell on San Quentin's death row, waiting for the warden of the prison and the prison guards to escort him to the gas chamber. Nor did he have to be there to describe the experience, for he knew exactly what it felt like. To be alone in a claustrophobic atmosphere, expecting the footsteps of death to come treading from the black unknown, was a blood-chilling business. When in doubt, he thought, run like a son of a bleep. And run like a son of a bleep he did. Back through the alleyways, back to the companion stairs, until at last his lungs were greeted by the pure, wholesome air on the deck. The early morning was still dark, and the derricks reached towards the velvet ceiling of a sky that was alive with a dazzling array of stars. There was scarcely a stir of wind. Over the bridge, the radio mast swayed back and forth across the Milky Way, and below Pitt's feet, the hull creaked from the rows of the gentle swells. He hesitated a moment, gazing at the dark line of the Thasos coast, yet a bare mile away. Then he looked down at the smooth black surface of the water. It looked so inviting, so peaceful. The flashlight still glowed. Pitt cursed his stupidity for not switching it off when he reached the open deck. Might as well have advertised my presence with a neon sign, he thought. He quickly doused the light. Then carefully, so as not to cut himself on the broken glass, he unwrapped his swim trunks and removed the remains of the lens. He hurled the tiny silvers over the railing and listened till the faint splash, like the rain of a pond, reached his ears. He was tempted to deep six the flashlight too, but his mind shifted into gear and rejected the impulse. Leaving the rack in the wheelhouse void of the flashlight would be about as clever as sending the captain, if there was a captain, a telegram and saying, just before dawn, there was a prowler on board your ship who ransacked it from stem to stern. It very definitely wasn't a smart move, not with people like these who had outfoxed nearly every law enforcement agency in the world. The fact that the lens was missing would be a gamble that Pitt would have to take. He glanced at his watch, then he hurried back to the wheelhouse. The luminous hand showed 4:13. The sun would be blossoming soon. He scrambled across the bridge and replaced the flashlight in the rack. His haste was almost frantic. He had to be off the ship, into his diving gear, and a good 200 yards distance before daylight gave him away. The forward deck was still deserted, or at least it still seemed to be. A fluttering noise came from behind Pitt. Instantly, he spun around in a sudden renewed fear and unsheathed the knife in one deft movement. His nerves were stretched taut to the border of panic. His head pounded like a drum roll. God, he thought, I can't be caught now, not this close to safety. It was nothing but a gull that had flown out of the night and landed on the ventilator. The bird pointed a tiny eye at Pitt and cocked his head questioningly, no doubt wondering what sort of crazy man would run around a ship in the early morning, clothed in nothing but a flotation vest while holding a knife in one hand and a sunbathing suit in the other. The relief made Pitt feel weak at the knees. It had been quite a scare, and he was badly shaken. When he boarded the ship, he didn't know what he expected to find. What he found was silence tinged with unknown terror. Limply, he leaned against the railing, getting a grip on himself. At this rate, he'd have heart failure or a mental breakdown before sunrise. He took several deep breaths, exhaling slowly until the fear subsided. Without a backward glance, he swung over the rail and shined down the shinning down the anchor chain, vastly relieved at departing the ghostly ship. It was a welcome comfort to be in the soothing water again. The sea opened its arms and gave him a sense of remoteness from danger. It took only a minute for Pip to slip on his swim trunks and retrieve his diving gear. Fitting an aqualung tank on his back in the darkness with the swells pushing you against the sides of a still hull isn't an easy operation. But the ditch and recover experience he had obtained during his early diving days came in handy now, and he accomplished the task with little effort. He looked around for the wooden crate, but it had drifted into the black curtain of night and disappeared. The wave of action and incoming tide, by this time, carried it halfway to the beach. He lay there dead in the water and considered the possibility of diving under the Queen Artemisia and examining her hull. The weird scraping noise he had heard in the engine room seemed to have come from somewhere outside the plates and below the keel. Then it occurred to him the plan was hopeless. Without an underwater light, he could see nothing. He wasn't in the mood to grope like a blind man along a 400-foot hull that was encrusted with razor-sharp barnacles. He heard the old tales that described in detail the ancient and brutal practice of kneel-hauling insubordinate British sailors. He remembered one particularly blood-curdling account of a gunner's mate who was dragged under the heel of the HMS Confident off the coast of Timor in 1786. Punished for stealing a cup of brandy from the captain's locker, the poor fellow was dragged under the keel of the ship until his body was sliced to ribbons and the white of his ribs and backbone were visible. The unfortunate man might have survived, but before the crew could hoist him back on board, a pair of mako sharks, attracted by the scent of the blood, attacked and chewed the man to pieces before the horrified eyes of the men on deck. Pick knew what a shark could do. He had once pulled a boy from the surf in Key West who had taken a nasty bite by a shark. The boy had lived, but a massive piece of tissue would always be missing from his left thigh. Pitt cursed out loud. He must stop thinking about things like that. His ears began to ring from a humming sound. At first, he thought it was a trick of his imagination. He shook his head violently. It was still there, only louder. It seemed to be gaining momentum. Then Pitt knew where the humming was coming from. The ship's generators had started again. The navigation lights blinked on, and the Queen Artemisia suddenly came alive with sound. If there was ever a time when the better part of valor was discretion, it was now. Pitt clamped the mouthpiece of the regulator between his teeth and dove clear of the ship. He kicked his fins with every ounce of power in his legs, seeing nothing under the ink-black water, hearing only the strange gurgling sound of his exhaust bubbles. It was times like this that he wished he didn't smoke. After covering nearly 55 yards, he surfaced and looked back at the ship. The Queen Artemisia rose at anchor in Tombstone solitude, her silhouette outlined against the graying eastern sky like an old-fashioned shadowgram. Dim shafts of white light came to life here and there about the ship, interrupted only by the green glow of the starboard navigation light. For several minutes, nothing more happened. Then, without any signal or shouted command, the anchor clinkered up from the seafloor and clanged into the hull. The wheelhouse was lit, and Pitt could see it clearly. It was still vacant. It just can't be, he repeated to himself over and over again. It just can't be. But the ship hadn't yet finished the last act of her ghostly performance. As if on cue, the Queen's Artemisia's telegraph jingled faintly across the calm pre-dawn sea. The engines responded with their gentle throb, and the ship continued on her voyage, the secret of her evil cargo still locked somewhere within her steel plates. Pitt didn't have to see the ship move to know it was underway. He could feel the beat of her propellers across the water. 55 yards was more than enough. At that distance, he was invisible to any lookout and had little to fear from being sucked through the huge propellers and mangled into the fish bait. A seething flood of frustration swept over Pitt as the great hull slowly slid past his bobbing head. It was as though he was watching a ballistic missile lift from its launching pad and hurl on its preset path towards devastation and death. He was helpless. He could do nothing to stop it. Hidden somewhere on the Queen Artemisia was enough heroin to drown half the population of the northern hemisphere in delirium. God alone knew what chaos would erupt in every city and town if it was distributed to all the peddling scum who preyed on malignant addiction. How many people would become listless dregs and eventually die from the drug's deadly narcosis? 130 tons of heroin on the ship. What was the song again? The little ditty that he'd sung all those years ago in school? 100 of bottles of beer on the wall? It had nearly the same ring, but it was for light hearts and souls, not drug minds and lost hopes. Then Pitt thought of himself, not with self-pride for destroying the yellow albatross or searching the Queen Artemisia and getting away with it undetected. He thought of himself only as an idiot for risking his life on a job he had no business performing, a job he wasn't paid to do. His orders were to expedite oceanographic expeditions. No one said anything about chasing after drug smugglers. What could he accomplish? He wasn't a guardian angel of humanity. Let Zaxynthus, Zeno, Interpol, and every other bleep cop in the world play cat and mouse with Von Till. It was their game. They're trained for it, and they were paid for it too. Again, Pitt swore loudly to himself. He had already spent too much time daydreaming. It was time to head for shore. Mechanically, his eyes watched the ship's light diminish bit by bit into the fading darkness of the early morning. He was just wading onto the beach when the sun lifted itself from the horizon and threw its rays on the rock-strewn rock-strewn summits of the Thasos Mountains. Pitt stripped off the tank and let it fall to the soft, wet sand, along with the breathing regulator and his mask and snorkel. Exhaustion curled its numbing tentacles around him, and he succumbed to it, dropping to his hands and knees. His body felt sore and beat, but his mind hardly noticed these things. It was busy with nothing else. It was busy with something else. Pitt could find no indication of the heroin on board the ship, nor would the Bureau of Narcotics or the customs inspectors. That much was certain. Below the waterline, that was a possibility. But surely the wary investigators would have divers examined every inch of the hull when the ship docked. Besides, there was no way a cargo of that size could be removed unless it was dropped in the water and recovered later. That wouldn't work either, he thought. It was too obvious. Retrieving a watertight container filled with 130 tons of solid material would require a full-scale salvage operation. No, there had to be a more ingenious method, one that had successfully defied detection for so long. He took the diver's knife and idly began sketching the Queen Artemisia's outline in the wet sand. Then, quite suddenly, the idea of a diagram intrigued him. He stood up and traced the hull that stretched for approximately 30 feet. The bridge, the holds of the engine room, every detail he could recall was etched into the yielding white sand. Minutes passed, and the ship started to take shape. Pitt had become so totally absorbed in his work that he didn't notice an old man and a donkey trudging wearily along the beach. The old man stopped in his tracks and stared at Pitt from a ripened old face that had seen too many decades of strife to show an expression of bewilderment. After a few moments, he shrugged uncomprehensingly and ambled off after his donkey. Finally, the diagram was nearly complete, down to the last companionway. The knife flashed in the new sun as Pitt added a final humorous touch, a tiny bird on a tiny ventilator. Then he stepped back to admire his handiwork. He stared at it for a moment, then laughed out loud. One thing's for certain, I'll never be acclaimed for my artwork. It looks more like a pregnant whale than a ship. Pitt continued to absent-mindedly gaze at the sand drawing. Suddenly his eyes took on a trance-like glaze, and his rugged face lost all expression. The spark of a novel and fanciful idea lit dimly in his conscious mind. At first, the idea seemed too outlandish for him to consider, but the more he dwelt on the possibilities, the more feasible it became. Quickly, he traced additional lines in the sand. Completely absorbed again, he raced to match up the diagram with the picture in his mind. When the last change was finished, his mouth slowly twisted into a grim smile of satisfaction. Bleep clever of Von Till, he thought. Bleep clever. He wasn't tired anymore. His eyes were no longer burdened with unsolvable questions. It was a new approach, a new kind of answer. It should have been discovered long before. Quickly, he gathered up the driving equipment and started to hike over the incline that separated the beach from the coastal road. There was no thought of quitting the game now. The next inning would prove to be the most interesting. At the top, he turned and looked back at the sketch of the Queen Artemisia in the sand. The rising tide was just washing over and erasing the ship's funnel, the funnel marked with the big Minerva M. And that is it, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that reading as much as I did. Sounds like Pitt has figured out how they're smuggling all this heroin undetected with nobody on the ship. So we'll figure out what's going on in chapter 14 next time we do this reading. Please support the channel, y'all. You know what I'm saying? Make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps us out. We're trying to grow and really have a legitimate, awesome book club around here. So that's all I got for y'all today. And as always, man, be safe, stay out of trouble, and I'll see you on the other side. I'm out, y'all. Peace.